this dark hour. Deliver us, hear our call, deliver us. Lord of all, remember us here in this burning sand. Deliver us, there's a land you promised us. Deliver us to the promise. A single thread in a tapestry, though its color brightly shine, can never see its purpose in the pattern of the grand design.
And the stone that sits on the very top of the mountain's mighty face doesn't think it's more important than the stones that form the base.
On earth, look through heaven's eyes. Look at your life. Look at your life. Look at your life through heaven's
הוציאנו ממצרים, הוציאנו ממצרים דיינו. אילו הוציאנו, הוציאנו ממצרים, הוציאנו ממצרים דיינו. די דיינו, די דיינו, די דיינו, 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 די דיינו, די דיינו, די דיינו, דיינו, דיינו.
Good morning, everyone. We ring this bell 3 times. The first is to call us back. Sorry. There we go. The first is to call us back into covenant. Each week we speak of the Ohlone people being removed and their land taken. We would do well to remember that the Ohlone share a story with all people who have been violently colonized, oppressed, subjugated, abused, and threatened with extinction. At various times, this was also the experience of the Jewish people, the Palestinian people, African people, Japanese and Chinese, and so on and on and on. We ring this bell to look carefully at our place in all of these stories. The second bell calls us into relationship with ourselves and one another to recognize broken promises, unhealed hurt, lingering scars, where being right was more important than being whole. We gather to forge an ever-widening circle of compassion and commitment until we are all beloved to one another. And the third bell calls us into covenant with our children and our children's children out to the 7th generation, helping us to realize that what we do now, or what we fail to do, will be felt by those who come after.
Good morning, everyone. I'm your worship associate, Drew Wilson, and happy to be here today. So, as you know, many are currently celebrating Passover, and Greg's sermon title references the first question that is asked by the youngest child at a Passover Seder. And that reminded me of an event that happened to me many years ago. So once upon a time, I ended up being the youngest person at a Passover Seder. This is at the age of 32, and got to ask the questions. Yeah, so having already asked the questions, which start with what makes this night different from all others, I now get courtesy of Greg to ask some new Passover questions, which come for the Beth El congregation in Sudbury, Massachusetts. So I am going to read the bold, and you can then read aloud the italics, and they will appear on the screen in a moment. What sacrifices would we make for freedom today? What would we leave? How far would we go? How deeply would we look within ourselves? Our ancestors had not time to wait the rising of the bread. Yet we, who have that time, what do we do to be worthy of our precious inheritance? We were raised in Egypt, but now we are free. How easy is it for us to relive the days of our bondage as we sit in the warmth and comfort of our Seder? How much harder to relieve the pain of those who live in the bitterness of slavery today. Okay, and now join me. Yeah, thank you, Greg. We could just light it directly. Hey, okay. We light this chalice to remind ourselves, treat all people kindly, because we are all one family. take good care of the earth because it is our home, live lives full of goodness and love because that is how we will become the best people we can be.
Good morning. Welcome to Mission Peak Unitarian Universalist Congregation. My name is Beth Schaefer. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm a member of the board. We're so glad you've joined us this morning. Unitarian Universalism is a radically inclusive, non-doctrinal, non-dogmatic, open-minded, and open-hearted faith. We are people who are all coming at truth from different paths. We gather together across different identities, experiences, and beliefs to affirm and promote the inherent worth of every person. Together, we see our job is to love the hate out of this world, heal the hurt in ourselves and one another, and to be the change we'd like to see in the world. If you're our guest for the first time, we welcome you. Here's a bit of information on how our hybrid services work. We use chat in Zoom or our book near the welcome table here to share our joys and concerns, personal milestones of importance, which will be read aloud in the service. We also have social hour after the service where we get to visit with one another in breakout rooms on Zoom or in the patio here. The worship host will give you more information about this immediately after the service. Someone from our membership team will put a link to our weekly newsletter in chat so you can see all the events coming up. We encourage you to join anything that speaks to you. We also put our welcome email, welcome@mpuuc.org, to request a newsletter or other information be sent to you. If you're here in person, our welcome table is right over there, again, where you can sign up to receive a newsletter or ask any questions you may have. Finally, please make sure your mobile devices are silenced. We're so glad to be together today. And let's end by asking everyone in Zoomlandia and everyone in Cole Hall to wave to one another and feel the joy of being one large beloved community. Welcome and thank you to our members and friends near and far.
A long time ago, the Israelite people were enslaved in Egypt. In Hebrew, Egypt is called Mitzrayim, which means a narrow place. But in order to understand how we got there, we have to go way, way back in time. A long, long time ago, there was a famine in the land of Israel. Nobody had anything to eat. To keep his family safe, Jacob moved them all to the only place they knew had food, Mitzrayim, or Egypt. Joseph, Jacob's favorite son, was already there. He had become prime minister of Egypt, assisting a kind-hearted pharaoh, ensuring that people had enough to eat. Over time and over many generations, Jacob's family grew. They soon became a great, mighty, and prosperous nation, and because of this, became a threat to a new pharaoh who did not know about Jacob and Joseph and all the wonderful things they did for Egypt. Out of fear towards these Israelites, Pharaoh enslaved them. He made them do hard work in the hot desert sun, commanding them to bake bricks out of mud and straw and to build cities like Pitom and Ramses. In their anguish, the Israelites cried out to Adonai, the God of their ancestors. God heard their voice and saw their suffering. Moses, having fled from Egypt after defending the Hebrew slaves, was a shepherd in Midian. God called to him from the midst of a burning bush. God directed Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let my people go. Pharaoh was not eager to free his slaves. When Moses came to talk to Pharaoh, Pharaoh said no. To convince them to free the Israelites, God brought 10 plagues to afflict Pharaoh and his people. Dam, blood. Tzfardea, frogs. Kinim, lice. Arov, swarms of beasts. Dever, cattle disease. Shechin, boils. Barad, hail. Arbe, locusts. Choshech, darkness. With each plague, Pharaoh grew more and more stubborn. Every time Moses asked Pharaoh to let the people go, Pharaoh said no. After the 9th plague, the plague of darkness, the Israelites were told to prepare for what was to come. Every family was to take a lamb and make a special sacrifice to God. They then put the blood of the lamb on the doorposts of their homes as a sign that Israelite slaves lived in those homes. The 10th plague was Makat Bechorot, striking down the firstborn sons of Mitzrayim. The Israelites were spared because of the blood on their homes. The angel of death passed over Pasach, the marked houses. After this 10th plague, the grieving Pharaoh relented and agreed to let the Israelites go. They were in a hurry. They knew Pharaoh could change his mind at any moment. They did not even wait long enough for their bread dough to rise. They quickly gathered their food and belongings and left Egypt as fast as they could. Sure enough, Pharaoh did change his mind. His army chased the Israelites into the sea, and just as the last Israelite stepped out onto dry land, the waves of the sea crashed down on Pharaoh and all of his men. The Israelites were saved. They rejoiced with singing and dancing, even as God grieved the loss of life of the Egyptians, who were also God's children. We remember these events today with the holiday of Passover, beginning with the Seder, a special meal that includes elements such as drinking 4 cups of wine, asking 4 questions, reading about and discussing the story of the Exodus from a book called a Haggadah, eating foods filled with meaning like unleavened bread called matzah and bitter herbs called maror, and through it all, trying to imagine what it would have been like to be a slave to Pharaoh in Egypt. We continue to tell this story each year at our Passover Seder because we know that if God had not freed us, we would all still be slaves. We recognize that the more we learn and talk about it, the more we can see the suffering of others and feel called to make sure that all enslaved people are freed, even today.
The Seder is about family, food, and freedom, and now it's also about war, according to a recent New York Times article. One excerpt from the article says, "At first I felt concerned, like, oh boy, this is a hard time to have a Seder," said Rabbi Susan Goldberg of Nefesh, an inclusive Jewish spiritual community on the east side of LA. She realized, though, that the Seder table was the perfect venue for the kind of dialogue so urgently needed. It's so direct in the Seder, she said. When we talk about freedom and captivity, how do you not think about the hostages? She added, then we say, let all who are hungry come and eat. And how do you not think about the people in Gaza who are starving? I wanted to share some of my thoughts about Passover and Seders. Some of the following comes from the Haggadah we have used here at Mission Peak UU, in which we used at my home Seder last Tuesday. A Haggadah is a text that sets forth the order of the Passover Seder. In the Jewish religion, Passover venerates the importance of freedom. It's a celebration of the liberation of the Hebrew people from the domination of the Pharaoh. From my perspective, the Passover holiday has two main goals. First is celebrating the freedom of each person attending the Seder. Second purpose is to stress the importance of freedom to everyone. As we heard during the story of Passover told just a few minutes ago, God intervened to help the Israelites escape into freedom by bringing 10 plagues to afflict Pharaoh and his people. The last and most horrible was killing their firstborn sons. This is a scary part of the story, knowing that God, an outside force, was needed to enable the Israelites to be set free, and that God needed to use horrific, violent action to succeed. The Seder is a reminder that we should work to build a good world in which justice and freedom shall be the inheritance of all people. I wanted to conclude by the words at the end of our Haggadah. May slavery give way to freedom. May hate give way to love. May ignorance give way to wisdom. May despair give way to hope. Next year at this time, may everyone, everywhere be free.
So now we might ask ourselves, what makes this Sunday the same as every other Sunday service? We take up a collection on Sundays for the simple reason that our purpose in gathering is for more than ourselves. We want to make sure that the ministries that we need, the ones that infuse worth and dignity into our children, our youth, and programs, and our programs of learning and leadership, and our ministries of anti-oppression, and our work in the larger world are in place to meet the needs of others. We hope you will make a contribution toward these worthy causes by mailing your check to Mission Peak UU congregation at the address on the screen. You can also use bill pay option in your online banking or drop your check into the Mission Peak mail slot, or pay online with a credit or debit card. Thank you for supporting and sustaining the efforts of our members, friends, and staff, and also for responding so well to the recent canvass. Your contributions make learning, loving, and leadership more possible.
For any who have felt exiled from where they feel most at home or feel alone in their suffering, this part of the service is the most meaningful. The part where we turn to one another to provide solace or comfort or understanding so that we have a sense of belonging that is with one another. If you have a joy or sorrow that by sharing with this community might bring hope or solace or meaning, if you are with us in line, type it into the chat. If you are here in person, there's a Joys and Concerns book back there. During the song reflection, you are encouraged to come by and drop a stone in our stone garden or sandbox. And if your concern is more tender and you would prefer to share it in a personal conversation, please see me or Reverend Barbara after the service. Thank you to Joanne, who gave us that Passover medley. And finally, one last stone for the hopes and hurts still too tender to escape our hearts. May, for the sake of love, we keep our doors, our hearts, our minds, and our arms open. Please join with me in the spirit of this reflection. Passover is an important time for the Jewish people. For people around the world, it is an 8-day celebration. Here in the U.S., it is on the second night that a ritualized meal with specific elements in a specific order known as the Seder is held. One of the central elements of the Seder is the story being told from the Haggadah, a word that translates as telling. A community is gathered for a ritual meal in 15 parts, including 4 cups of wine to make sure that it is a joyful occasion, the breaking of the matzah, the hiding of the afikomen to be sought by the children, the 4 questions asked by the youngest in attendance, the telling of the Exodus, a story of the Jews' escape from bondage in Egypt, the recitation of the 10 plagues, the eating of the maror, bitter herbs to symbolize the bitterness of enslavement, the enjoyment of dinner and the gladness of the company, followed by a dessert of matzah, and the blessing to conclude the meal, L'shana haba'ah ya bi Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem. I am Jewish, and although the family I grew up in was not observant, I've been to a number of Seders over the years. I've developed a deep appreciation for the ritualized importance put into celebrating such a layered and complicated message. Now, most of the Seders that I have been to have been with Unitarians who are really good at adding their own quirky liberalism and irreverence without removing any of the natural complication of the process. And this year I am glad, because as Steve shared in the testimony, this year is a particularly complicated time for any humble observant to honor the tenets of Passover. The state of Israel was created many years ago amidst great tension and the threat of Jewish extinction. The state of Israel is now at war with Hamas. There is no question that the extremist actions of Hamas, the Houthis, and Hezbollah are cruel and calculated provocations. But many observers question whether Netanyahu's right-wing coalition is really just taking advantage of this moment to exercise trauma and domination within the Palestinian territory and advance his own political agenda. College students are pointing out this duplicity across the U.S., disrupting campus operations and demanding that their universities divest the billions of dollars they hold in endowments from anything supporting the state of Israel, including any investments which might profit off of the war, which of course implicates the U.S. government, who, as you know, subsidizes a great deal of the weapons that go to Israel. Students are being arrested. They're being called anti-Semitic, as is anyone who criticizes U.S. foreign policy. Many would consider the concerns that I raised this morning in the service to be anti-Semitic, although I'm working very hard to balance my sincere reverence for the Jewish people and their right to exist with an expectation that the state of Israel be accountable for any unjustified violence or harm they cause. What are any of us Jew or Gentile alike, who believe in liberation, supposed to do? To what God do we turn to call for mercy and ask that the killing and violence pass over innocent lives? A moment of silence. The first thing to know about Passover is that it is a defining story of the Jewish people. Led by God, the Israelites' exodus from enslavement in Egypt required courage to rise against the will of Pharaoh and write themselves a new story. The story they must write needs to have a seamless conjunction with the story of their past. Built on a promise made and kept against odds over generations, it is a story of persecution, suffering, loss, change, but ultimately, it is a story of liberation. This is at the heart of what it means to be Jewish. It is why so many Jews gather during Passover for the Seder meal. It's at the Seder that we ritualize the old story so that we can imagine a new one. The story itself comes from what's called a Haggadah. Take note, I did not say from the Haggadah. The story of the Jewish people, of exile, of enslavement, of suffering, of faith, of intervention, of exodus, and finally liberation, is not drawn from sacred fact or verified historical documents. They are part of many interpretations because there are other stories that describe Jacob and Joseph and Moses and Aaron, their time in Egypt and their exodus from enslavement into freedom in Canaan. The book of Exodus in the Bible is one of many accounts of how the tribe of Judah came into Palestine. There are so many other books that also tell the story of how the Assyrians came into the area, as did the Babylonians, as did the Persians and the Greeks and the Romans. Indeed, scholars and theologians will tell you that it is not books as facts that any of us are deliberating over. It's the stories within the books and how those stories are told and retold and turned into ritual and remembrance that build identity and loyalty. That's what is so powerful about the Jewish people, is their amazing ability to build rituals that tell the story of their journey. But as any Jew will tell you, there are infinite variations and interpretations to those stories. And such things make the stories richer and more interesting and more powerful. Anyone who has ever been in a room filled with Jews telling stories knows the beneficent wrestling match that comes into play as interpretations do battle with one another, also known as midrash. So there is not one story of the Exodus, of the Jewish liberation. There are many. And so it may surprise non-Jews to know that there is not one Haggadah that tells the story of liberation. There is a compendium of Haggadot, plural for Haggadah. There is a feminist Haggadah, a leftist Haggadah, an LGBTQ Haggadah, a Black Lives Matter Haggadah, a recovery Haggadah, a migrant Haggadah, a human rights Haggadah. There is even a January 6th Haggadah and an October 7th Haggadah. There is a Seinfeld Haggadah. There is a Shakespeare Haggadah. There is a COVID-19 Haggadah. There is even a Star Wars Haggadah known as Darth Seder. You can even find an emoji-based Haggadah. Soon there will be a TikTok Haggadah, a Game Boy Haggadah, and probably a rap Haggadah. Why so many? Because so many of us, like so many Jews, have not only old liberation stories, we are part of creating new liberation stories. The story of liberation itself is not done being told because most of us are still in the midst of our own exile, our own exodus of one sort or another. So this morning I'd like to write a new Haggadah that calls us to explore the ancient exodus from our current perspective. And to do it, I'd like to draw on an old part of the Seder ritual that keeps the door open and a chair empty for a place at the table. Traditionally, this has been for the prophet Elijah, often known to Jews as the angel of the covenant. But it is also in the tradition of this welcome, we invite any who are hungry and any who yearn for a covenant that promises liberation, and any who seek the company of those from whom they might find the courage to pursue it themselves. So in that spirit, you will notice that I have set out a few more empty chairs because I think Elijah needs some help this year in particular. So I set out a chair for our student protesters and a chair for the university chancellors who are being called anti-Semitic if they allow other opinions about what's happening in Israel to be voiced on their campus. A chair for the uber-rich university donors who use their money as a megaphone, accusing others of being anti-Semitic. A chair for our U.S. Congress, who are often the other great recipients of uber donors, who used their position to be a loud narrative on the topic of policy and liberation. Perhaps the most important chair might be for Mr. Netanyahu and his cabinet, and one for leaders of Hamas. The last two chairs I set out for my great-great-grandparents, Harris and Sarah Becker, who lived as Jews in Strij, now part of the Ukraine. In the mid-1800s, they fled when half of the town of Strij was burned down, something not uncommon in predominantly Catholic towns where Jews tried to establish themselves. They migrated to nearby Austria and then sent their son alone to New York, where he married and established my mother's side of the family. For me, they represent sacrifice and struggle and the courage to pursue a new story of liberation. I wanted them, as I want all of those, to be present for our conversation this morning. Each one of the people in these chairs brings a different and important story. But if you were here last week, you heard how sometimes we all bring a story into a midrash that we might be holding on to too tightly. And stories held too tightly can sometimes become weapons rather than wisdom. Last week we talked about 6 old stories that get told over and over by the animals of a certain village, stories about power over, stories of revenge and retaliation, stories of hiding and isolation, or of scapegoating and demonizing, stories of selling our souls for shiny objects or for feeling sorry for ourselves. And we asked ourselves, amidst that telling and retelling, its own kind of Haggadah, what does it take for us to get to that 7th story, that larger story of liberation? Why are so many in the world getting stuck in those small stories of control and dominance? The liberation story of the Jews is taken from the book of Exodus, where Moses asked Pharaoh to let the Israelites go, but Pharaoh held tightly to his own ego-driven story of power over. When Pharaoh refuses Moses' request, then God brings plagues upon the Egyptians, water turning to blood, frogs, lice, the rest. After each plague, the Pharaoh's advisors go to him, seeing the catastrophe that his stubbornness was causing. They say, "Let them go. Don't you realize that Egypt is being destroyed?" But Pharaoh's arrogance and ego would not let him. It's interesting to point out that according to the text on Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, the word Egypt in the book of Exodus is Mitzrayim. However, the name is a play on the Hebrew Mitzerim, meaning a narrow strait or a tight place. When God took the Jews out of Mitzrayim, he pulled them out from a tight place or constricted opportunities or within rigid control and narrow-mindedness. It's interesting how easy it is for so many of us to imagine others getting hemmed into impossible choices by their own stubbornness. But don't each of us live at least a little bit in our own Mitzerim, our own tight places, where often we become so attached to the rightness of who we are, of where we go, of who we see, of how we spend our time and our money of who we support, who we condemn. It's something that I've really appreciated about the Jewish people and the Jewish culture, and about Passover story in particular. It's the duality woven into almost all the Passover symbols, like the way those words Mitzrayim and Mitzerim play on each other. There is an intention to add intrigue and complexity, to reveal the interesting ways we are both so liberated and yet also still so much in exile, free to espouse our virtue and yet still enslaved in our own hardened hearts. This week, I was playing around on a website called slaveryfootprint.org. Has anybody been there? It's a website that allows you to input the conditions of your life. You put in where you live, what you eat, if you drive, what kind of car do you drive, the products that you use, the electronics that you own, the jewelry that you wear. And it will take all of that information and it will take into account what was required to mine those materials, to manufacture them, to pass them down a supply chain, and it will tell you how many slaves were required for you to reach your current lifestyle. I put in all of my data and I pressed the button and I tested out at 45 slaves. My heart stopped when I saw that number. I have always tried to live a simple and conscientious life, but I also know that I am not the only one whose actions have unintended impact. I can't tell you what learning this means exactly. In some ways, I am still stuck in that narrow place, figuring it out, deliberating, pausing, paralyzed, but I can tell you two things. One, it adds focus to the numbers I have heard from several human rights organizations who concur that today, in 2024, there are over 40 million enslaved people living on the planet. That is more than the total number of enslaved people associated with the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. It is one of the reasons why our prisons are so robust and have operated for so long as for-profit corporations. And two, it makes me reevaluate my impulsive instinct to radically differentiate myself from Pharaoh. When I think about what it would take to reduce the number of slaves required for me to live the way that I live, I realize that the very next question I would have to ask myself is, what would I be willing to give up? And that is when some of the arrogance and contempt I feel when thinking about those people who are perpetuating or even profiting off the war in Gaza begins to fade away. And I begin to notice more clearly the uncomfortable similarities in ways we all navigate through our own narrow places. Contemporary Jewish theologian Rabbi Yael Levi writes, "It is the narrow place, the place our heart and our hardened perspective have to traverse. It is the narrow place of fear and anxiety and mistrust that makes it so difficult to be compassionate and understanding and generous. If we can imagine that all of us have our own Egypts to escape, might we be more generous imagining the liberation of others?" This responsive exchange is from one of Rabbi Levi's several Haggadahs. It is time, the Infinite calls. Come, I will take you out. I will deliver you to a new place. I will help you transform. I will take you into relationship, and you will know your beloved place amid the myriad of all life. I can't, the soul cries. I am so afraid. Of course you are, the Infinite responds. You have been in the narrow place for so very long, but I will lift you up. So just for a moment, you will see the expanse of possibilities. Then you will decide what is more frightening, to stay where you are or to step out towards what you might be. When the Israelites were provided a path of escape, they left in a hurry without even the time for the bread to rise. But by the time they made it down to the Red Sea, they looked back and saw the dust rising from Pharaoh's army, who was in pursuit from a distance. Pharaoh had changed his mind again, and the people of Israel knew that he was closing in and they were trapped. Now, I probably don't need to tell you how this turned out. Anyone who has seen the Ten Commandments remembers when Charlton Heston, who was Moses, lifts his staff and the sea parts before him. But I will also remind us, the literal Hebrew translation from Exodus for the body of water the Israelites stood before was translated as sea of weeds. We've always referred to it as the Red Sea, partly because if we said it was just a bunch of seaweed that appeared at low tide, it loses a little of the epic cinematography that Cecil B. DeMille had in mind. But here's where it's important to remember that it's not literal. These are stories. These are translations, not facts or historical documents, because it's not only about what the Israelites did, but what we, generations later, do when we reflect on our place in their story. In some ways, I think Sea of Reeds makes it easier to look back and see our past rushing towards us, only to turn and see our future as a bed of slimy, smelly muck that we have to enter into if we truly want liberation. That is the narrow, stuck place the story wants us to experience. Feeling that crossroads moment, knowing that part of us is willing and part of us refuses. There is a poem from the book called Readings to Enrich Every Jewish Holiday, where Rabbi Janet Ruth Fallon offers a rather poignant and humorous version that explores what it must have been like for the Israelites trapped between their militant and oppressive past and their uncertain and ominous future. The poem is called What We Need in Order to Take the Plunge. Before we take the first step, she says, all of us would need a life jacket and aqua socks against the jagged sea floor, and an inflatable inner tube, and waterproof sunblock SPF Infinity, and wraparound shades from LL Bean, and a hat that deflects the sun, and a Swiss Army knife with a toolbox of attachments, and a supply of Red Cross certified confidence, and a pack of space-age dehydrated food, and a camel hump of spring water. And then we would only go after a week's notice so we could cancel the paper and eat up the perishables and make arrangements for the dog, all so we might summon the chutzpah to step off that platform of cheerleaders we have been standing upon. But by that time, the narrow path would have closed, the cleft receded, the mirage evaporated, and the trio that you can't touch, conviction, fearlessness, and faith, would have all melted into the desert sun, and all of us who remained behind would have been swallowed up by the sand. It may have been in days of old that it was fine to gather together with our own tribe and to hold our own Seder. And we may or may not have written into our Haggadah the Jewish gift of calling forth the double-sidedness of our stories. And it all may have been okay with Elijah, but today's Passover can no longer be limited to gathering together a single tribe. The angel of the covenant must rise to meet the magnitude of the moment, the complications of what we face, and implications of our own impact on each other's quest for liberation demands that we set a more open table. Everyone needs to come and bring forth their story, and each story must be shared and unpacked and heard for the ways it lifts our eyes to the liberation possible, and yet also the ways that it may unintentionally leave us all still stuck in a narrow place. We must learn to gather for the collective Haggadot rather than the personal Haggadah, or we will die in the desert sun of our own intractable indecision. The path forward is a narrow one, but it forces us all to walk together. And on the other side, if we do travel together, we will finally get a chance to learn what happens when all of our stories are blended into the collective liberation of that seventh story. As Steve suggested earlier in the testimony, we are all called to such gatherings with two goals: our own personal liberation and the collective liberation of all people, because they are related, as Nelson Mandela reminds us. Liberation is not merely casting off one's own chains, but living in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. So let me close with these words that Steve reminded us of our own Haggadah here at Mission Peak. May slavery give way to freedom. May hate give way to love. May ignorance give way to wisdom. May despair give way to hope. Next year, at this time, may everyone, everywhere, be free to the glory of life.
Okay, please join with me in reciting these words to extinguish our chalice. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Friends, one hand on your heart, one hand reaching out to others and to the future. May we all have the courage to rise up out of the stuck places in our lives. May we have the love to turn to those around us and invite them to a more generous shared story. May everywhere slavery give way to freedom, hate give way to love, ignorance give way to wisdom, despair give way to hope. May everyone this time next year enjoy freedom together everywhere. Amen. Blessed be. And thank you to David, who did a fantastic job as our host. And there are snacks and foods and delights in the kitchen.
And just a moment, if I could have your attention.
Oh.
Well, we've had the wonderful celebration and learning about Passover today, and we have another celebration to have too. First of all, there are snacks. There's a continental breakfast today provided as a gift from Julie Ganslin. This is very kind of her to celebrate Greg's 25th anniversary in the ministry. And we have a little gift for him too. Would you like to open that?
Sure. How exciting. I got breakfast in bed yesterday, or breakfast while I was writing the sermon anyway.
Oh, nice.
But this is even better. That wasn't wrapped. Level 25 complete. May it be known